Today is Thursday, August 6, 2026, and today is National Root Beer Float Day. And I appreciate a root beer float because it is basically what happens when someone looks at a glass of root beer and says, "This is good." But what if we also needed a spoon? It is part drink, part dessert, part science experiment, and part of childhood memory. You pour the root beer over the ice cream. The foam rises like it is trying to escape the glass, and suddenly you have a very important decision to make. Do you wait? Or do you start drinking before your kitchen becomes part of the experiment? It is simple. Root beer, ice cream, foam. A little chaos. And honestly, that fits August 6th. Because today we are looking at moments where something that seemed permanent suddenly changed. First, we'll look at an empire that lasted nearly 1,000 years before finally disappearing. Then we'll visit a movie theater where audiences got their first real taste of the future of film. And finally, we'll see how one ancient tree changed the way people thought about preserving the past. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and your reasonably calm guide through humanity's long history of strange decisions. On August 6, 1806, the Holy Roman Empire officially came to an end, which is a strange sentence because the name itself sounds like it should be simple. But the Holy Roman Empire was famous for being complicated. It was not exactly holy. It was not exactly Roman. And it was not an empire in the way most people imagine one. It was a collection of kingdoms, duchies, cities, religious territories, and local rulers that held together under an authority of an empire. More like a political network than one unified country. For centuries, it survived through shifting alliances, religious conflicts, wars, and arguments over who really had power. Its roots stretch back to Charlemagne, who was crowned emperor in the year 800. But by the early 1800s, Europe was changing quickly. And one person changing Europe more than almost anyone else was Napoleon Bonaparte. After Napoleon's victories, several German states joined the Confederation of the Rhine, pulling power away from the old imperial structure. The Holy Roman Empire was becoming something that existed more in tradition than reality. The title remained, but the power behind it was fading. So on August 6, 1806, Francis II made the decision official. He abdicated as Holy Roman Emperor and released the states of the empire from their obligation to him. And just like that, an institution that had survived kings, wars, religious conflicts, and centuries of change came to an end. Not with a final battle, not with a dramatic collapse, not with a castle falling, with a document, a political decision, a title being surrendered. That is what makes the ending of the Holy Roman Empire so interesting. Sometimes history does not end with a dramatic moment. Sometimes something simply reaches the point where it can no longer continue. An idea that once made sense no longer fits the world around it, and eventually, everyone has to admit that the old way is gone. And from an ancient political structure disappearing, August 6 takes us to a different kind of transformation. This time, it's not about governments. It's about entertainment. On August 6, 1926, audiences gathered at the Warner Theater in New York for the premiere of Don Juan. The movie starred John Barrymore, one of the biggest stars in the silent film era. And technically, Don Juan was still a silent movie. There was no spoken dialogue. Actors were still performing in the style that had defined silent films for decades. But something had changed. Don Juan used the Vitaphone system, which synchronized recorded music and sound effects with the film. For audiences, that was a new experience. The movie was no longer completely dependent on live musicians in the theater. The sound was attached to the film itself. Today, that seems ordinary. A movie without sound feels incomplete. But in 1926, this was a major shift. Silent films were not primitive. They were an art form. Actors had mastered the language of expression, movement, and emotion without spoken words. Directors knew how to tell stories visually. Audiences understood the rhythm of silent cinema. But technology was changing. Sound was arriving. And Don Juan was one of the first major signs that the old way of making movies was about to disappear. A year later, the jazz singer would make talking pictures impossible to ignore. But Don Juan was one of the moments where Hollywood first realized the future was coming. The film itself was not the end of silent movies. It was the beginning of the transition. And sometimes that is how change happens. Not all at once. Not with one dramatic moment, but with a small sign that the world everyone knows is about to become something different. And if the end of an empire shows us that even powerful things can disappear, the story of Prometheus shows us something else. Sometimes we do not realize the value of something until it is already gone. In 1964, a graduate student named Donald Curry was studying bristlecone pine trees on Wheeler Peak in Nevada. Bristlecone pines are not the kind of trees people usually imagine when they think of something ancient. They are not enormous like redwoods. They are not perfectly shaped. They are twisted, weathered, shaped by thousands of years of wind, cold, and difficult conditions. But that is exactly what makes them remarkable. They grow slowly. They survive where other trees cannot. And inside their rings, they hold a record of the past. Scientists can study those rings and learn about ancient climates, droughts, and environmental changes. Curry was researching one particular tree, a bristlecone pine that would later become known as Prometheus. He was trying to determine its age. When he had trouble getting the sample he needed, the tree was eventually cut down with permission from the Forest Service. Only afterward did researchers realize just how old it had been. Prometheus had been alive for thousands of years, possibly before the pyramids of Egypt were built, before many of the civilizations we study in history have existed. It had stood through wars, empires, languages, generations of human beings who would never know it was there. And then it was gone. What makes this story complicated is that it was not destroyed out of carelessness. It was cut down as part of scientific research. The people involved were trying to learn something important, but it became a lesson of its own. Understanding something is not the same as owning it. Studying something is not the same as replacing it. And sometimes the things that seem ordinary are carrying a history we do not recognize until it is too late. And that idea brings us to someone whose career also changed the way people looked at something familiar. Because sometimes the people who become legends are not the people who started out looking like legends. Sometimes they are simply people trying to find where they belong. She started as a model. She appeared in small movie roles. She was another young performer trying to make it in Hollywood. One of her early appearances was in a Three Stooges short called Three Little Pigskins. At the time, nobody watching could have known they were seeing someone who would eventually become one of the most important figures in television history. Today, we are talking about the one and only Lucille Ball, born on August 6, 1911. The interesting thing about Lucille Ball is that her story is not just about becoming famous. It is about becoming powerful. Before the red hair, before I Love Lucy, before the famous comedy scenes that generations would remember, she spent years trying to find the role that fit her. Hollywood knew she was attractive. It knew she could perform. But it didn't immediately understand what made her special. The answer was comedy. Physical comedy. The willingness to look ridiculous. The ability to turn ordinary situations into complete disasters while making every moment feel natural. On I Love Lucy, she found the perfect place to use those talents. Lucy Ricardo was funny because she was human. She wanted attention. She wanted success. She wanted to be part of things she was not always ready for. And somehow the chaos always felt familiar. But Lucille Ball's story became even bigger than the character she played. With Desi Arnaz, she helped build Desilu Productions into a major force in television. The company helped shape how television shows were produced, filmed, and distributed. Later, Lucille Ball became the first woman to lead a major Hollywood studio. That is the part that can get hidden behind the famous scenes. The candy factory, the grape stomping, the impossible schemes, the comedy. She was not just someone who made people laugh. She was someone who helped build the industry around them. And that is what makes her story fit today. The Holy Roman Empire was more complicated than its name suggested. Silent movies were already changing before they disappeared. A tree held thousands of years of history before anyone understood what it represented. and Lucille Ball became much more than the character audiences first saw. Anyway, the more I work through history, the more I realize that the things we remember are often not the things that look important at first. Sometimes they're old structures that finally fall. Sometimes they are small changes that quietly reshape the future. Sometimes there are people who spend years becoming the person everyone remembers. And that reminds me of something Lucille Ball once said. The secret of staying young is to live honestly, eat slowly, and lie about your age. If you'd like to hear more of my work or see other corners of the internet I've been quietly building things in, you can head over to waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns. Thanks for hanging out with me for a few minutes. I'll see you tomorrow.